AJ always has interesting topics. He does a great job for the Department of Conservation, and today he's going to tell us all about the elk program in Missouri. So let's give AJ a warm up.
Question, how many of you are aware that we have reestablished an elk population in Missouri? Okay, most everybody. Now I'm going to do another survey. If you remember a time when Missouri had very few deer and it was difficult to see them, give me a show of hands. Okay? Now, if you remember someone telling you a story about how rare deer were, raise your hands. Okay. It's interesting to me, when I was a kid, my grandfather told me about a time when the local school shut down because someone had a deer track in a field, and the whole school was canceled so everybody could go to that farmer's field, lift that bucket, and look at that deer track. Now, I tell that story to my children, and they look at me as though I am from Mars. Because if I ask them, how many of you have seen a deer in the last week? Let's just do that. How many of you have seen a deer in the last week? Yeah, we've seen deer, okay? That was a conservation story that we are now on the other end of. Deer have been restored. In some places, management is a challenge. Now, one thing I want to point out, conservation and balance doesn't just mean we don't want to lose them. It also means we want to balance the population to make sure we have plenty, but not too many. And so I want to talk to you about another conservation story. This one has to do with elk. Elk were last reported in Missouri at the time of the Civil War. Now, we have a few elk ranches around Missouri, but those are essentially agricultural situations. They are not wild elk. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's going on. I've had the privilege of being involved with this program from the information standpoint. I've been able to be on the ground, take some pictures, tell stories, and it's been a neat opportunity. And I want to share that with you today. So, first things first, I want you to see where elk have been, because if you're like me, before I ever really started to look into this, I thought of elk as a western species. They're in the Rocky Mountains. Take a look at this. You see that kind of olive drab that goes all the way across the continent here? That is the former range of elk in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Do you see how they cover pretty much the entire continent? Now the red, that's where elk are today. I do want to point out this population of red over here in Kentucky. That population of elk was an established population from elk herds out here in Utah, Colorado, and Nevada. That's where the Department of Conservation eventually got their elk, because now we have a population right in the center of the Ozarks. I'll tell you a little more about that in a bit. If you're not familiar with the fact that Missouri used to have elk, let me show you a couple things to help fill you in on the gaps. We have a lot of place names in Missouri for elk. Elkhorn, Missouri, Elk Creek, Elk Bluff, Elk Ridge. These things are not the type of thing that you name. For example, you don't look around and see Bighorn Sheep Ridge in Missouri, because we don't have bighorn sheep. We also have a lot of first-hand sightings. For example, Lewis and Clark, when they went up the Missouri River, every time they saw elk, they would write this down in their journals. I want you to notice a lot of counties don't have information on them. What that means is someone was there who saw elk who either didn't write it down or couldn't write it down because they weren't literate. And the Ozarks was a very hostile place to live. People wanted to live close to where the transportation was, where they could farm, make a living. And the Ozarks, anywhere in Missouri back in the 1700s and 1800s, was the most hostile, difficult place to make a living. So you don't see a lot of people in the Ozarks who can write to make these observations. But when you do get those journal entries, when you do get those instances where someone finds an elk antler or a tooth in an archaeological pit, we see that they were all over the state. And the very last place to find elk in Missouri was southeast Missouri, in particular down in the Boot Heel in the swamps. That was a surprise to me. Elk lived in all kinds of habitats. Just for sake of discussion, if you haven't seen an elk, and let's say you travel out to where we've reintroduced the elk. You go out there one morning and you see a bunch of deer and you think, oh my gosh, that one's kind of dark. Is that an elk? Is that an elk? When you finally see the elk, there is no doubt in your mind. This is what an elk is. A couple things to look for. First of all is size. When you see the elk, oh my gosh, those things are huge. They've got several hundred pounds on a deer. But some of the minor things, I want you to notice, deer antlers slope forward, elk antlers slope backwards. Elk have kind of a lighter rump. Calves, cows, bulls, they all have it, whereas white-tailed deer don't have that. Elk also have this kind of dark, shaggy mane on the neck, and deer clearly do not. So it shouldn't be an issue. We do try to educate folks who do hunts out at Peck Ranch and Current River Conservation Area. We want to make sure people know the difference. We haven't had elk in the state for a while. Let's bring people along. I do want to discuss why elk are not here. They were one of the first animals to leave Missouri. And what I mean by leave is they stopped reproducing here. There weren't enough of them to carry on a population. It's not like they migrated away. They disappeared because of two things. One was unregulated hunting. Now I say unregulated because there were no laws. You could kill what you wanted, when you wanted. You could do a cow, you could do a bull, you could do a calf, it didn't matter. And you could kill as many as you wanted as long as you saw it. That's unregulated and it's not sustainable. The other thing that caused this was habitat destruction. Everything needs habitat. We need habitat, so do the animals. And there was never really a margin made in for the elk. And as their habitat got converted into towns and farm fields, they didn't have a place to hang out and do what they need to do. So by the Civil War, elk were gone. They're very easy to eradicate from that standpoint. They don't reproduce rapidly like deer do. And so from the standpoint of leaving the state, or what we call extirpation, they were one of the first. Now, the reason we brought these animals back has a lot to do with citizen involvement. The Missouri Department of Conservation was developed by the citizens. The tax that funds us was developed by the citizens. And the request to bring elk back to Missouri was made by citizens. The Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation approached our Conservation Commission and said, we would like for you to do a study and consider to do this. 10 years ago they did that, and our answer was, we're not real sure this is a good idea. We didn't have a reliable test to deal with chronic wasting disease to make sure that a live animal was disease-free, and there were some other issues we weren't prepared to deal with. They approached us again about 4 years ago, and at that point we couldn't find a reason to say no from the standpoint of all the things that we were concerned about. We also had some concerns the citizens brought to us, and we were able to address those, and we moved forward. The place we chose was Peck Ranch Conservation Area in particular. Now we made an elk zone that was larger than Peck Ranch, but we chose Peck Ranch as kind of ground zero for another reason. It wasn't just because it was big, it's because we've been doing conservation management on this place that's kind of cutting edge, or at least it was at the time, for almost 30 years. One of the things we've been doing is prescribed fire. Now, how many of you in here are familiar with prescribed fire? Okay, it used to go under the name controlled burning, but we realized that really wasn't an accurate phrase. It's prescription. Just like you go to your doctor and your doctor says you need to exercise, that's prescription. If he says you need to take this drug, that's prescription. There are certain habitats that do much better when you have fire on the landscape at the right time, and that's the prescription. We've been doing that at Peck Ranch for a very long time, and as a consequence, we have open areas like this. All we have to do to this is light a fire in March, and this stays like this all the time. Trees tend not to grow back. Why? Because it's really rocky, thin soil, and we call those glades. Perfect place for all kinds of unique animals and plants. In fact, this particular glade called Mule Hollow Glade, you go out to Peck Ranch, you look on a map, you can find it. That has the largest diversity of plants of any glade in Missouri. Now, I don't expect you to go home and tell your spouse, oh my gosh, you're not going to believe what I learned about glades today. But for us, for those of us who are into that kind of stuff, that's cool. That's a really neat place, and fire is part of the prescription that maintains that. We have woodlands, which is kind of like a savanna. It's a forest with widely spaced trees and grass growing underneath it. It's a cross between a prairie and a forest. So these woodlands and savannas are very important. Another part of the puzzle out there at Peck Ranch, turkeys were, let me back up. We also had a rare time finding turkeys back in the 1920s and 30s. In the 1940s, Missouri decided to restore its turkey population. You know where they got their turkeys? Peck Ranch. That's where the remnant population of turkeys were. Right across the river, the Current River, in the Current River Conservation Area, there's a place that we all call Deer Run. Well, Deer Run was where about 200 plus deer lived, and they were about half of the population of deer in Missouri at the time. So that area is very unique. We've done a lot of conservation. It's had a hand in restoring other species, and here's one that we've had a major success. It's going to be hard to see from a distance. That's called a collared lizard. Collared lizards are about this long, and if you ever see one in a Missouri glade, they run on their hind feet to get away from you, and you look at them and think, that could take a finger. I'm not really sure I want to see that lizard up close. But he's pretty harmless. He's a beautiful lizard, and he's actually a desert critter. And the only reason he's here in Missouri is because of glades. And if you don't have fire, you don't have glades. Those turkeys need the glades, the deer need the glades, they need the woodlands, and it's a really neat place. Has anybody here been to Peck Ranch, just out of curiosity? Okay, I'm going to encourage you to look at it sometime. Take a trip over there. If you're driving between here and Springfield, you're going to pass a sign on 60 that says Peck Ranch. Drive it. You will see a part of Missouri that looks the way it would have 200 years ago. The way we see forests today is not the way Missouri looked 200 years ago. And I'm not saying we need to take Missouri back there totally, but this is a glimpse in the past. Neat, neat place. Okay, so once we decided, yep, we want to reintroduce elk, we talked to Kentucky. Kentucky said, yes, you can come get some of our elk. So we built a pen over there, trapped some, we baited it. And once we had the elk, we had to hold them for 90 days, and we did health testing. And you'll notice I've got a big red arrow right here. It's really hard to tell, but there's a little section where some of that elk's fur has been shaved off. They did a tuberculosis test. They took blood samples. They took, and I'm not trying to be gross, samples around the rectum. They took saliva samples. They tested all kinds of tests for at least 9 different diseases that are communicable to agricultural interests. And we had to make sure that not just one, but all of those animals were 100% disease-free before they ever made the trip to Missouri. If one of them popped positive, none of them came. So we really worked out well. We did the testing. We brought our first batch of animals to Missouri. When we brought them to Missouri, we did not want to simply back up a truck, put the ramp down and say, born free, because you know what happens? They start running and they don't quit until they reach Arkansas or Illinois. Depends on which direction they're pointed. So we had something called a soft release. And what that means is we put them in a pen again. And in this particular pen, I want you to notice we had these oblong sections here. Here's one, here's one, here's one. There were a number of them. This one over here might be made just for the bulls. Bulls don't tend to get along real well with others if they're in a small confined area. So we put them by themselves. Let the boys duke it out amongst themselves. We would put cows over here, cows with calves over here, and another place for cows and calves. You don't want calves being trampled. And that happens on an accident. Once you notice, we do have some round bales up against the wall. That's for the elk's safety. If they get to running, they build up speed and they can't make the turn, they'll run into the fence and break their neck. So we put bales of hay in there to prevent that from happening. While they're there, they're chilling out. They calm down from the trip over from Kentucky, and it gives us an opportunity to get a few of them into some chutes. And we do a little work on them. We do some final testing of their health. We try to make sure their collars are in good shape. We have GPS transmitters on them. We have UHF transmitters on them. And we also have a microchip under the hide. We want to make sure we know where these animals are, what they're doing, and how they're coexisting with the land. Once they arrive, we let them off the truck, they go in the pen, they do their run until they realize they can't go anywhere. They've got a lot of space, plenty for them. And they hang out there for about 10 to 20 days. Here's what happens at the end of all that. We open up the gate, and they stay in the pen. Well, maybe they start to realize, hey, they're not feeding us, and they wander out of the pen, they wander back in. They wander out of the pen a little further, they wander back in the pen. And I've gone to that pen site now for 3 years in a row, and I have seen 4 instances where there are elk in the pen with the gates wide open and they've been wired open. They are not afraid of this pen. They're pretty used to it, but they use the entire area. In that facility where we were dealing with the collars, those collars help us to track the animals, to know where they are. So if we were to have one die, that animal stops moving, we know it, and we're able to find out where it is, and then we can determine why did it die. Because we still want to make sure that we brought healthy animals to Missouri and that they're not causing another problem. If there is something going on, we want to know what factors are affecting this population. And now, you can go to Peck Ranch. This is not sectioned off where you can't go there. We have opened this place up, and you can go to Peck Ranch or Current River Conservation Area, and you can drive those areas in the early morning or in the late evening, and you can see elk wild in Missouri. It's not something that's in the past, it's a present day deal. From our studies, we have found that these elk have interesting patterns. So this is a map of where all the collars come back. It's kind of a density survey, and it shows you where they hang out the most. Red being the most, blue being the least, or white being non-existent at that time. This was during July. and these animals were in some of the areas where we had done the prescription of fire. They were hanging out where it had been burned because the vegetation was tender, it was nutritious. That was the place to be. A little later in the season, the acorns drop, their movements change. When they start dropping calves, their densities change. The cows go to places where nobody else hangs out to have their cows, other than the calves. That's different. So the time of year matters, what's available for food matters, and we're finding a lot more out about how they live here in Missouri. And just because you hear something about how elk behave in Colorado, it doesn't mean that's how they're going to behave here. I'll give you an example. Home ranges in Colorado are huge. They have a lot of snow, and their vegetative growing season is very short compared to ours. Our vegetation is longer to grow, it's more nutritious, and we don't have all that snow. So the elk territories are much smaller. They don't travel and wander so much. So we want to make sure we understand what are elk going to do here in Missouri. We had a good idea, but we're fine-tuning it. It's getting into where we're really in focus. We've had 2 arrivals since then. I have up here second, but there's actually been a third. And I've had the opportunity to be at all 3 of these. And I've had a chance to take pictures and tell stories about what went on. And folks, from my perspective, on that third one in particular, it was, you know what? I've been a part of history. These animals have not been here since the Civil War, and I get to see them come off the truck, get on Missouri soil, and then I get to see them on the habitat, on the landscape. And that's pretty cool. Now, I mentioned some concerns, and I'm going to be real upfront with you. We had some people initially, when we were talking about this, we had public meetings and open houses, and we said, so what do you think? And we had some people say, bring them on. And then we had some other people say, now wait just a minute. I've hit a deer with my car. I don't want to hit an elk. They're bigger. They'll do more damage. I'm scared of that. Well, we started looking at what other states have had experience with. Take a look at this. Kentucky has 1,000 elk, and they've had about 10 vehicle incidents per year. Arkansas has 500 elk, and they've had 1 or 2 vehicle incidents per year. When I got to looking at that, the interesting thing, let's say you and I are driving down the road, and we decide to stop and take a look at some elk off in a field. Well, then somebody comes behind us and says, "Ooh, there's elk!" Bam! Runs into us. You know what that's classified as? An elk-related vehicle incident. Now, I'm not saying that that's all of them, but you've got that mixed in there along with somebody comes around a corner and there's an elk in the road. So it does happen. Now, I'm going to be real upfront with you about that. However, we have chosen an area of Missouri that has lower human population, lower road density, and much more habitat than what Arkansas has or Kentucky has. And we have yet to have any vehicle incidents so far, knocking on wood. We had some people that were concerned about fences being broken down. They were worried about alfalfa fields being decimated. And what we have learned from other states, if you get one call, get on it right now, go in that field, harass that elk, and then if you have a problem with them again, put the elk down. We're not going to let them get used to this and learn it's okay to do it. That's our commitment. If a landowner has a complaint and we're not able to deal with it through harassment, we'll put the elk down. And in a couple of cases, we've had the landowner say, no. Well, I'm not that mad about it. And it's working. It is working. So we've tried to address concerns. We've tried to make sure there's no disease in these animals. We've tried to make sure if there's any complaints, we deal with them. And we really think we've done a pretty good job so far, and we're going to continue to fine-tune and make sure that works for us, because we want to see this be successful well into the future. If this works the way it does in Kentucky, Kentucky had 4 separate instances where the public said, expand the elk zone, expand it. I don't know if we'll be able to do that because of habitat, but that shows you that people there, they like it. And that's something that's important to them. So if you'd like to peck ranch, and I want to see you do it, I want to show you what to look for. First things first, tracks. Elk are big, they have bigger tracks, so that's your first clue. But you notice the toe on here is just a little bit bigger, a little more rounded than what a deer track is, and I have the same quarter next to each one of these. These tracks were made a couple of days apart, photographed on the same day. I don't mean to be gross after you've eaten your lunch, but scat. It looks like a bunch of large milk duds out of the landscape. And the reason I mention that, you can find out where the elk have been and get a better idea of the habitat they hang out in. I went to a ridge one time. I was taking pictures of the habitat because that's part of my job. And I looked down and I saw scat pile after scat pile after scat pile. And I realized I was in a bedding site. And I started to look around and get a good idea. Oh, I now get a better view of what they're looking for when they hang out and go to sleep. So when you see that scat, you get an idea of their habits, and then you know where to look, and you know how to kind of figure out what they're doing. Antler rubs. Most of you are familiar with deer antler rubs. I want to show you something on this. It's a little light in here, but over on the right is a deer antler rub, and I want you to notice it starts from here at the waist all the way down on this guy. Same guy, same day. See, that's a deer antler rub. Deer have to put their head down and get those antlers to rub up on that tree and spar and rub. But look at an elk from the waist up. And I will tell you that I saw other trees that were some of them about 4 inches in diameter, and that tree lost. So there's no doubt in my mind that was an elk rub. So you're going to see that, and you know what? It's not hard to find that at the right time of year. These are pretty common. So it's kind of exciting. You're out there, and you see these rubs, you got that scat on the ground, there's tracks, you think, oh my gosh, I'm in the thick of it. You got to make sure you're looking really, really hard. These are not as common as the deer, and they are skittish. They're wild animals. This is not a zoo. They hang out. You see this particular elk right here? This was with a telephoto zoom. There's one right here, and you can't tell because he's behind the tree, but there's a rump of one right here. And they were off on a ridge. And if I didn't just happen to see a glimpse of movement, I never would have detected these two. They would have been immobile, and I never would have known they were there. So if you go to Peck Ranch, here are good places to look. It's a green browse plot. They are grazers primarily. So you go out in the early morning, go out to these green browse plots. It's a good chance you're going to see them. Another good place, those glades. They have a variety of vegetation. It's nutritious, it's tender, elk love it. They also hang out in the forest. Now, the only reason I don't put that at the top of the list is because, yeah, they spend a lot of time there, but it's hard to see them. They blend in with the shadows. The elk hang out there because they can see a long distance. They can bed down at the top of a ridge, and they can see all the way to the bottom. Because of all that fire, the understory's open. It's not like a forest here. You stand up on a ridge and Trail of Tears, you will not see the valley below because it's too densely vegetated. So, but they do hang out there, and sometimes you do get a glimpse of them. So it's good to know what you're looking for. Here's an elk that I saw, and if it hadn't been for the collar, I never would have seen her. You see her in there? And sometimes they just really blend into where they are. I did get a chance last year to hear an elk bugle, and I'm sure all of you have heard this, perhaps on TV, or you've got an app on your phone, or maybe you've heard somebody use a call. But when you hear that in the wild, I'm just going to tell you, the hair stood up on my arms and the back of my neck. Whoo! That was neat. And I'm not a touchy-feely kind of guy. That was neat. So you go there. Here's some things. Learn what kind of elk habits, what's going on during that time of year. What do they need? What are they eating? What are they doing? Summertime, they're going to be super, super nocturnal. They're going to be bedding during the day. Not your best time to see elk. Wintertime, they might be out all day long. Really good time. So learn their habits. Keep in mind, elk are wild animals, so yeah, you might see one, you might get out of your car, take a picture. This is not the zoo. These are wild animals with huge antlers. Did I mention they're sharp? Treat them as wild animals. Try not to approach them really. Don't push your luck on that. I don't want to hear about a situation where a pedestrian got into a situation with an elk. And then if you want to see them, the best time, I would say 90% of my sightings have been early morning or the hour right before sunset. Those are the 2 times I've most reliably seen elk. And that's the really important stuff. Good timing, I'm actually just about done. All right. Yeah, it says enjoy, we're good. Okay, so what I want to conclude with is this. Many of you know that we didn't have deer, and it was through a committed action of the citizens that we restored deer and wild turkey and wood ducks and Canada geese and muskrats and beaver and a whole bunch of wildlife, and as well as the habitats they depend on. Missouri is a rich state, not just in visual beauty, but in natural resources. Conservation-related activity is a $7 billion industry annually. $7 billion. Due to conservation, that's logging, hunting, fishing, all of that has a trickle-down effect. We're a rich state, and it's because of conservation. This is a conservation story that is unfolding. One day, people like me are going to tell grandchildren I remember a time when there weren't any elk in Missouri and you couldn't go see them. And how this unfolds not only is due to citizen involvement, but it is still foundationally involved with citizen support and approval. Right now, if I did a survey in the town of Van Buren on support for the elk, I'll bet you I would have a 9-to-1 ratio in favor of elk. And it could be even larger than that. Most of the concerns have not proven to be reality, and the people are really enjoying it. The tourism in that area has picked up, and it's been a real economic boom. Within the next 5 to 10 years, I expect to see a hunting season for elk open up, because that's one of our methods for managing the herd to ensure that they are at an appropriate level in an area that they're welcome. So with that, I really appreciate your attention. Thank you for inviting me. And if for whatever time there's left here, I would be delighted to visit with questions. Yes, sir.
As far as the growth rate and things like that, what do you see prospectively down the road through the years as far as population growth?
Population growth is going to be very modest at best. You have to keep in mind that instead of, like deer, they will breed sometimes the very first breeding season, or maybe second, whereas elk, it's third or fourth, so it takes them longer to reach maturity. It also means that they don't have as many calves. They'll have one calf, whereas deer can have 1 to 2, and these animals, they'll wait a little longer to have those animals. They just don't grow as fast as what a population would for white-tailed deer. So we don't see them growing exceptionally fast, and if for some reason we were to have kind of a big boom, that's something that would be pretty easy to contain through management. So I don't see us being overrun with elk in the next 10 years. That's not going to happen. We just want to make sure that we have the appropriate level of elk for what habitat is out there. And while I'm thinking about it, I just want to mention that, yeah, we're doing a lot of work on Peck Ranch and Current River Conservation Area. In Reynolds County, because I know the numbers there, 90% of the landowners in the elk zone are voluntarily doing some sort of elk management on their own. And I say voluntarily. They came to us and ask for expertise or cost share, which they can receive. We don't twist their arm. That's not mandated. They're doing it because they want elk on their property. I would imagine they're mostly thinking, hey, I want to hunt one, and I want them coming to my property on a regular basis. I don't blame them. So population, it's going to be slow, conservative, but as it grows, we're going to stay on top of it to make sure it stays in the appropriate levels.
How many are out there?
Good question. We have a few calves that have been born that we are not able to find. When a cow drops her calf, she goes into the most dense, inhospitable territory as possible. So we haven't collared every calf, but to answer your question, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 120 to 130. And this all started with about 40 elk 3 years ago. So it's looking pretty good.
I remember when, I guess before they came, the debate was going on, and you guys were doing different public hearings. I remember reading an article about a University of Missouri professor that thought that elk were just in northwest Missouri and were never down in this area, or south central, I guess is what you would consider Van Buren. Based on your presentation, I guess the conservation department just doesn't agree with that, or the article just had quotes from him. I don't remember conservation.
I can't speak for him. I don't know what he based that on. I can tell you what we based that on. We looked through every journal of every explorer that came through Missouri. If there was a reference, we noted it about where it was. And then we were able to put it within 1 or 2 counties. You might be on the wrong side of a county line, and that's about it. So we would look at any archaeological dig, that kind of stuff. So we used evidence from past explorers, surveyors, things like that, as well as comments about went to a cabin, somebody had antlers on the wall, you asked the person who owned the cabin, and this was in the 1820s. This is where they came from. It's just off the hills here. So that's what we did to establish that elk were distributed statewide. Yes, sir.
Is there any other animals like bison or something that's on the agenda to be the next thing that you would reintroduce?
That's a good question. You know, those agendas really belong to the public by and large. If we have an emerging population like we do with black bears, that's a different scenario where now we have bears, we need to manage them. But right now, the Department of Conservation has no agenda, no plan to reintroduce bison or wolves or any other animal. If these animals start to take up residence, then we have to manage them. If there is a citizen-led movement to request us to look at it, we will look at it. So there are things like that. A good example of that, the American burying beetle, which is a little bug that eats dead stuff. And it's not the kind of thing that you say, ooh, great, I'm glad to have it, but it's a part of our biodiversity. It's a part of the ecosystem, and it's just all the puzzle pieces. We're trying to get it back. That was something that was requested by a group of people who said, I think we can do it. We can help bring this animal back from the brink of extinction, and we reintroduced them in southwest Missouri. So that's been a beneficial thing. But as far as plans, has a lot to do with the citizens and what they want, and if it's possible. So we would have to take a look at all those things. Yes, sir.
Do the white-tailed deer and the elk live in the same range, or will you
Yes.
find elk and deer over there?
They overlap. They have similar habits during certain times of the year. Good example, elk and deer both eat acorns. There's no doubt about that. Deer eat vegetation out in the field, but they tend to be browsers. They're the type, they're going to eat shrubs and tender shoots off of trees, especially in the spring. Elk tend to be more of the type they want to eat tender vegetation from fields, grasses, wildflowers, things of that nature. So that their needs overlap a little bit, but they are not identical. And you can see both animals in the field at the same time. Yes. How are we doing on time? Good?
One question on mountain lions, AJ. I mean,
Yes.
Have you all gotten, I know there's been lots of sightings, and it seems like there have been more sightings.
Yes.
Where do you all stand on that?
Well, we definitely have mountain lions in Missouri. The one thing you won't catch me saying at this point is, I don't think we have a population. Here's why I say that. Game cameras are now inexpensive. We have more of them out on the landscape. We're getting much better evidence. Before, we would have stories. And if I have somebody, I've got a crazy uncle, and he can tell me all sorts of things, and I'm not going to believe it. But the adjoining landowner, who's very responsible, would have a story, and okay, he's credible. If I don't know the two individuals, I can't tell the difference between he's imagining things to this guy really knows what he's talking about. But now when we can get a photograph of the track, or people have a photograph of an animal that we can go to the exact site, do some measurements of the vegetation, take a look at hair samples. Now we are 100% sure we have mountain lions in Missouri. We have not found a female, and we have no evidence we have cubs. We have had mountain lions, especially in the Ozarks, and we have had a couple of calves, elk calves, that have been eaten on by mountain lions. I strongly suspect those calves had brain worms, which causes them to have a debilitating degeneration in their ability to perceive what's going on, to act normal, and eventually they're going to die. So that mountain lion either was predating on an animal that was going to die anyways, or they're eating an animal that was already dead. So we do have sightings. We had one just last month, and it was around the Peck Ranch area. So I don't know if we're seeing the same animal or multiples. We'll know more as time goes on. The more and more evidence we get, the better view we have of what's going on with mountain lions. Good question. Thank you. And gentlemen, I really appreciate your time. I'm going to hang around just a little bit, help take some things down. I'm going to turn it back over to you. Thank you very much for your time.